Hey everyone, ready to dive into a world where Big Brother is always watching.
Always watching, that's right.
Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into George Orwell's 1984.
One of the greats.
And I have to say, the excerpts that you provided, focusing on daily life in Oceania and Winston's thoughts, it's got me completely hooked. But it gets even more interesting because you've also included some historical analysis to try to figure out what inspired this whole dystopia.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Hmm?
You'll be surprised by how much Orwell's own context really shapes the themes of this novel.
So our mission today, first, I want to really try to experience the world of 1984 through Winston's eyes, find those details that make it feel believable. And second, I kind of want to peel back the layers of history a bit to see what anxieties Orwell was grappling with
Right.
when he created this vision of the future. It's like holding a mirror up to our own times in a way.
Yeah. 1984 isn't just a futuristic tale. It's a reflection of human nature and the dangers of unchecked power. A warning that resonates just as strongly today as it did back then.
Okay, so first things first, let's paint a picture of daily life in Oceania.
Yeah.
I mean, telescreens everywhere, watching constantly,
Oh, yeah.
even when you think you're alone.
Yeah.
It's enough to make you paranoid.
For sure.
And then you've got these dilapidated buildings, shortages of basic things. Like, remember when the chocolate ration got cut?
Oh, yeah?
It's like they're trying to squeeze the joy out of life.
Well, and to kind of numb that misery, there's Victory Gin. Orwell's really clever with the way he uses those sensory details to create this atmosphere of oppression.
Yeah.
You can practically feel the grime and taste the gin and hear the telescreens buzzing in the background.
Totally.
You get claustrophobic.
And then you've got the slogans everywhere. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. Talk about messed up logic.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a constant repetition that makes it so effective. I mean, these contradictions just become ingrained in people's minds. And what's even more unsettling is we kind of see this doublespeak in our own world today. Think about how certain groups twist language and manipulate public opinion or justify actions.
Right.
It's all about controlling the narrative.
Wow. That is a scary thought.
Yeah.
It makes you realize how easily we can all be manipulated if we're not careful. And it's not just the big obvious things that are unsettling. It's the little things, too. Remember that part where Winston is struggling to fix a leaky pipe in his apartment?
Oh, yeah.
Even simple repairs become a monumental task because everything is so run down and inefficient.
Well, that's what I find so brilliant about Orwell's world building. It's the little details, the everyday frustrations
Right,
that make the oppression feel so palpable. You start to understand the grip the party has on every aspect of life,
Right.
even the mundane. In this constant state of disrepair and scarcity, it creates a sense of powerlessness, and it's incredibly effective.
Yeah. And speaking of feeling powerless, let's talk about the 2 minutes hate. Orwell describes it with such intensity. I mean, you can practically feel the rage and the hatred, the blind fury of the crowd.
Yeah.
Even Winston gets swept up in it, even though he knows it's all orchestrated.
It's such a fascinating psychological phenomenon.
Yeah.
This collective release of, pent-up emotions, directed at Goldstein.
Right.
This shadowy figure who may not even exist.
Right.
It's a textbook example of scapegoating,
Yeah.
a tactic used throughout history to unify a population by giving them a common enemy.
It's a reminder that we're all susceptible to this kind of manipulation, especially when we're feeling afraid or insecure. And that brings me to something that I thought was really intriguing, the historical analysis that you provided. It turns out, Orwell might have been inspired by some pretty dark political realities of his time. I mean, we all know that he was a socialist, but he became disillusioned with how socialism had morphed into something quite different, in practice.
Right, yeah. The rise of totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, it had a profound impact on Orwell's thinking. I mean, he saw firsthand how ideology could be used to justify oppression and violence.
Right.
Even by those who claim to be fighting for the good of the people.
Yeah.
So this disillusionment is woven into the very fabric of 1984.
So you're telling me there were real-world figures, real-world events that influenced the creation of Big Brother and the party. Who are we talking about here?
Well, there's this guy, James Burnham, a political theorist. His book, The Managerial Revolution, it predicted that this new class of technocrats and bureaucrats would rise to power.
Okay.
Effectively controlling society from behind the scenes. Sound familiar? So this idea likely influenced the whole tripartite power structure in 1984. Oceania, Eurasia, and Eastasia locked in this perpetual war.
Right.
It's a brilliant way to maintain control.
Yeah.
You keep the population in a constant state of fear and divert their attention from the real issues.
Wow. It's like Orwell took these real-world anxieties and he amplified them, creating a terrifying but believable vision of what could happen if we're not careful. But hold on, wasn't Orwell also worried about the British Labour Party? The very party that he aligned with? That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but it speaks to his intellectual honesty and his willingness to critique even those that he agreed with. So he was concerned that even well-intentioned movements could become authoritarian if they weren't careful.
Okay.
He saw the potential for the Labour Party to become too centralized, too bureaucratic, too focused on control rather than on individual liberty. It's a warning that resonates really with many political movements.
So he wasn't just pointing fingers at the bad guys. He was warning against the dangers of unchecked power, regardless of ideology.
Exactly. Orwell wasn't trying to predict the future. He was holding up a mirror to human nature, showing us those dark possibilities that lurk within us all. It's a cautionary tale, that transcends any specific time or place. It's about the eternal struggle between freedom and control, between individual liberty and the seductive allure of power.
Okay, so we've set the scene. We've got this oppressive atmosphere, this sense of paranoia and constant surveillance. Now let's talk about Winston. This guy is surrounded by all this darkness, but he's still trying to find a glimmer of hope, a way to rebel against the party's control. Remember that moment where he writes, "Down with Big Brother" in his diary?
Yeah, definitely.
That takes serious guts, knowing the consequences.
Absolutely. That diary becomes this symbol of Winston's desperate attempt to reclaim his individuality and connect with some kind of truth in a world where truth is constantly being manipulated. It's a powerful act of defiance, but it's incredibly dangerous. And that tension, that constant fear of discovery, is what makes Winston's story so compelling.
You can practically feel the weight of the party bearing down on him. And it's not just the fear of being caught. There's this constant pressure to conform, to self-censor, to wear this mask of obedience, even when you're alone. Remember that quote where he says he had set his features into the expression of quiet optimism, which it was advisable to wear when facing the telescreen?
Yeah, for sure.
It's like you can never relax, never let your guard down.
Well, that's the insidious nature of totalitarianism. It infiltrates every aspect of your life, even your thoughts and emotions. You're constantly being watched, judged, evaluated. It's a recipe for paranoia and self-doubt.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating is, we see echoes of this in our own society today.
Oh, yeah.
With the rise of surveillance technologies and, the pressure to conform to certain social norms.
Right.
It's a reminder that the fight for individual liberty is this ongoing battle.
And what about Winston's attempts to remember his past? It's like the party has wiped his memories clean, leaving him with these fragmented, distorted images. He can't even trust his own recollections.
Well, that's one of the most chilling aspects of 1984, is the party's control over history and memory. They rewrite the past. They erase anything that contradicts their ideology.
Right.
And if you can't trust your own memories, what can you hold on to?
Yeah.
It's a way of controlling the present and shaping the future by manipulating the past.
Yeah, totally.
I think you'd be surprised by how often historical narratives are shaped to fit certain agendas.
Right.
Even in seemingly objective sources. Think about the history you learned in school. Whose perspective was it told from?
Right.
Whose voices were silenced or marginalized? It's something that I think we all should be more critical of.
Wow, you're right. We often take history for granted, but it really is just a collection of stories, and those stories can be told in many different ways. What about that old prole that Winston tries to talk to in the pub? It seems like he's searching for some connection to the past, but all he gets are these vague memories and a longing for cheaper beer.
Oh, it's a brilliant way for Orwell to illustrate how effectively the party has rewritten history.
Yeah.
Even for those who live through it. The old man's memories, they're fragmented and unreliable. They're more focused on trivial details than any real understanding.
Yeah.
It's a subtle but really powerful way to show just how insidious propaganda can be.
Totally.
And how it can warp our perception of reality.
It's like they've erased any sense of shared history.
Yeah.
Any collective memory that could challenge their version of events. It's a chilling thought. And then you've got Winston's job at the Ministry of Truth, where he literally alters records. Talk about a messed up job description. I mean, he knows the truth, but he's forced to participate in the lie.
Well, it's a perfect example of how totalitarian regimes function.
Yeah.
They rely on complicity.
Yeah.
On individuals being willing to participate in the system even if they know it's wrong.
Yeah.
And often that participation is driven by fear.
Right.
Winston knows that if he refuses to play along, he'll be punished, maybe even vaporized. He's trapped in the system that demands obedience.
It's a moral dilemma that resonates even today. We all face moments where we have to decide whether to speak out or to stay silent, for the sake of our own safety.
Yeah.
Orwell forces us to confront these uncomfortable choices.
Exactly. 1984 isn't just a story about a dystopian future. It's a story about human nature.
Right.
About the choices we make when faced with oppression, and about the courage it takes to resist.
Speaking of courage, let's talk about Syme, Winston's colleague, who's obsessed with Newspeak. I mean, this he's creepy.
Oh, yeah.
He's actually excited about shrinking the language, destroying words. He genuinely believes that it will make people less capable of thinking for themselves.
Well, Newspeak it's a brilliant and terrifying concept.
Yeah.
It's linguistic engineering taken to its extreme.
Yeah.
And what's so chilling about Syme is that he's a true believer.
Yeah.
He sees this destruction of language as a positive thing.
Right.
A way to purify thought and eliminate dissent.
Yeah.
And the scary thing is we see this kind of thinking in the real world, too.
Wait, hold on. How so? Can you give me an example?
Sure. Well, think about the ways certain groups try to control language, to limit what can be said or even thought. We see it in political correctness, in attempts to censor certain words or ideas, in the way language is used to shape public opinion. It's all about narrowing the range of acceptable thought and expression.
Wow, that's disturbing. It makes you realize just how powerful language is and how easily it can be used for manipulation.
For sure.
What about duck speak? It's mentioned a few times in the excerpts, but I'm still not quite sure what it means.
So duck speak is basically the ability to just spout the party line without thinking.
Okay.
To repeat slogans and phrases without any real understanding. It's a form of uncritical obedience, and it's rewarded by the party.
Mm-hmm.
Think about those heated online arguments where people just hurl insults and talking points, without actually engaging with each other's ideas. That's duck speak.
You're right.
A way of shutting down critical thinking and debate.
I've definitely seen that kind of behavior online. People just repeating slogans and talking points without actually thinking for themselves. It's like they're like robots programmed to parrot the party line.
Yeah.
It's not just online. We see it in the real world, too, when people blindly follow authority figures or accept information without questioning it.
Exactly. And that's what makes 1984 so relevant today.
Mm-hmm.
It's a warning about the dangers of uncritical thinking, of surrendering our ability to question and analyze information. We need to be vigilant.
Right.
We need to develop those critical faculties.
Yeah.
Be skeptical of those easy answers and simplistic narratives.
Okay, so we've got this oppressive world. It's constant surveillance, this manipulation of language and history. It all seems pretty hopeless, right, for Winston. But then Julia enters the picture, and suddenly there's this spark of rebellion, a hint of something more. I mean, she's like a breath of fresh air.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Julia is a fascinating character. Mm-hmm. She's more pragmatic than Winston, more focused on, the here and now.
Right.
She's not trying to understand the grand scheme of things or bring down the party or anything.
Yeah.
She just wants to live her life, experience pleasure, and carve out a little freedom.
Yeah.
And in a way, her approach is just as subversive as Winston's.
Yeah, because by simply choosing to live her life on her own terms, she's rejecting their control. And those moments that they share together, the secret rendezvous in the countryside, that rented room above Mr. Charrington's shop, they're like these little pockets of resistance.
Oh, yeah. There's so much symbolism in those moments. Mm-hmm. Nature represents this, kind of purity, a freedom that's been lost in Oceania. Their rented room with its antique furniture and the lack of a telescreen symbolizes a time before the party. Time when people could live their lives without this constant surveillance. It's a reminder of what's been lost and what they're fighting to reclaim.
But as we know, even the smallest flicker of rebellion is incredibly dangerous in Oceania. Their stolen moments of freedom are tragically short-lived.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's true. And the way that Orwell foreshadows their downfall is masterful.
Yeah.
Remember Mr. Charrington, the seemingly harmless old man who rents them the room? He turned out to be a member of the thought police. It's a chilling reminder that no one can be trusted in this world, not even those who appear to be on your side.
And then there's a hidden telescreen in the room, the ultimate betrayal. It's like they're always watching, waiting to pounce. And when they're arrested, it's brutal, swift, and utterly devastating. The shattering of the paperweight, it symbolizes, the destruction of their fragile world, the crushing of their hopes.
It's a turning point in the novel.
Yeah.
A descent into a nightmare. And from here on out, Winston's journey takes a much darker turn. He's about to face the full force of the party's power, and it's going to test him in ways he never could have imagined.
So we've established the setting, we've delved into Winston's character and explored the chilling realities of life in Oceania, but now the real psychological battle begins. We're about to enter the Ministry of Love, and things are about to get really dark.
It's a journey that will force us to confront the darkest aspects of human nature and the seductive allure of power. Buckle up. We're about to go deep into the heart of Orwell's dystopian nightmare. The Ministry of Love, huh? It's a place that evokes pure terror. The irony of the name itself is just another layer of Orwellian brilliance.
It's like they've taken all the things that humans are supposed to cherish, love, truth, peace, and they've twisted them into tools of oppression. But what I found really disturbing was the way they break people down. It's not just about brute force.
Right.
It's calculated, this psychological manipulation that really gets under your skin.
It's a process of just stripping away a person's identity, their beliefs, their very sense of self, isolation, sleep deprivation, constant bombardment with propaganda,
right,
and of course torture. They're all part of this horrific recipe. And what's truly terrifying is that these methods aren't just fiction. We've seen them employed by totalitarian regimes throughout history.
I was reading about the psychological effects of isolation and sensory deprivation. It can completely disorient a person, make them doubt their own sanity.
Oh, yeah.
It's like the party's trying to break down any resistance before it even begins.
Absolutely. And then they introduce O'Brien, this enigmatic figure who, at first, seems to offer a glimmer of hope. Remember that line, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness."
Oh, yeah.
It's so cleverly deceptive.
Yeah.
It plays on our human desire for connection, for someone to understand our struggle.
I have to admit, I totally fell for it the first time I read the book. I thought maybe O'Brien is part of the resistance.
Right.
Maybe there's still hope for Winston. But then you realize that the place where there is no darkness is the Ministry of Love.
Yeah.
Where the lights are always on and there's no escape from the party's gaze.
It's a masterful twist, and it reveals the depth of the party's control. They infiltrate every aspect of life, even your hopes and dreams.
Yeah.
And O'Brien, well, he becomes the embodiment of the party's ideology. His pronouncements about power and control are some of the most chilling passages in the novel.
Right.
He argues that power isn't a means to an end, but an end in itself. Control is the ultimate goal, and everything else is secondary.
It's like he stripped away any pretense of morality, any claim to be working for the good of the people. It's just it's raw, unadulterated power wielded with chilling conviction. But what really gets me is that he seems to believe it. He's not just some cynical manipulator. He genuinely thinks that this is the only way to order society, to protect people from themselves.
That's what makes him so dangerous.
Yeah.
He's a true believer, a fanatic. And fanatics are always the most difficult to reason with. Their certainty is just unshakable. Their logic is twisted, but it's internally consistent. It's like trying to argue with a brick wall.
I'm trying to imagine what it would be like to be in Winston's position, facing someone like O'Brien. It's like your very soul is under attack. Your fundamental beliefs are being challenged and dismantled. And then there's the whole concept of doublethink, believing two contradictory things at the same time. I mean, how is that even possible?
So doublethink it's essential for survival in Oceania. It's a form of self-induced cognitive dissonance, a way of reconciling the party's version of reality with your own lived experience, even when they clash. You have to accept that 2 + 2 = 5 if the party says so,
right?
Even though you know it's not true. And what's fascinating is that we see this kind of thinking in our own world today.
Wait, really? Give me an example. I'm struggling to wrap my head around this.
Sure. Well, think about how people can hold contradictory beliefs even when presented with evidence that challenges those beliefs. We see it in political partisanship, in religious extremism, in conspiracy theories. People they cling to their beliefs even when those beliefs are demonstrably false.
Yeah.
Because those beliefs provide a sense of comfort,
right,
of certainty, of belonging.
So it's not just about being forced to believe something that you know is wrong. It's about choosing to believe it even when the evidence suggests otherwise.
Exactly. And that's what makes doublethink so insidious. It's a form of self-deception, a way of shutting down critical thinking and embracing a simplistic, comforting narrative.
It's like choosing ignorance over truth.
Yeah.
Even though it means sacrificing your own intellectual integrity. And then there's that infamous scene where O'Brien forces Winston to believe that 2 + 2 = 5. It's like a symbolic breaking point, the moment where he finally surrenders to their version of reality.
It's such a powerful moment because it just shows how easily our perception of reality can be manipulated. I mean, if you can be convinced that something as fundamental as math is subjective, then anything is possible.
Right. And then there's Room 101. The ultimate unknown, the place where everyone's deepest fears are realized. It's like a black hole of terror that hangs over the entire novel. We know it's coming, but we don't know what's inside until Winston is confronted with his own personal nightmare.
And what makes Room 101 so effective is that it's tailored to each individual. The party knows your deepest fears, your vulnerabilities, and they exploit them ruthlessly. It's the ultimate weapon of psychological control.
I remember the first time I read the rat scene, it was visceral and terrifying and utterly unforgettable. You can practically feel Winston's terror, his desperation to escape this unbearable horror of his worst nightmare. And in that moment of absolute panic, he betrays Julia. He begs them to do it to her instead, to put the rats on her face.
Mm-hmm.
It's a heartbreaking act of self-preservation, but it also shows just the depths of their cruelty.
It's a moment that reveals the limits of human endurance.
Yeah.
The point at which even the strongest will can be broken. And what's so chilling is that the party doesn't just want obedience. They want complete and utter submission, even if it means turning you against your loved ones, betraying everything you hold dear.
And ultimately they succeed, don't they? Winston he's broken completely and utterly. He renounces Julia, embraces Big Brother, and accepts their version of reality as his own.
It's crushing defeat,
Yeah.
both for Winston and for the reader. I mean, we've been rooting for him all along, hoping against hope that he'll somehow find a way to resist, to hold on to some shred of his humanity. But the party's power is too great. Their methods are too effective. They crush him, body and soul.
It's like a warning about the fragility of our own beliefs, our own sense of self. If someone like Winston, with all his courage and determination, can be broken, what hope is there for the rest of us? But wait, there's that scene at the end after Winston's been released. He runs into Julia and they both admit to betraying each other. There's this sense of emptiness, of resignation. But is there also a hint of something else?
That's possible.
A flicker of defiance.
Maybe. It's a haunting encounter. It's full of ambiguity. Have they truly been broken by the party? Or is there some part of them that remains untouched? Some inner core of resistance that even the Ministry of Love couldn't reach?
Yeah.
It's that ambiguity that makes 1984 so haunting. We're left wondering about the true nature of Winston's final transformation.
Oh.
Did he really surrender his soul to Big Brother? Or is there a spark of rebellion hidden beneath the surface?
Yeah, I've read the book multiple times and I still can't decide.
Right.
It's like Orwell wants us to grapple with that question, confront the unsettling possibility that even in defeat, there might be a glimmer of resistance.
It's a reminder that the human spirit is so complex and resilient. Even in the face of overwhelming oppression, there might be a part of us that just remains unconquerable, a flicker of defiance that can't be extinguished.
It's a powerful thought, but it's also terrifying.
Yeah.
I mean, if even Winston can be broken, what hope is there for the rest of us?
Well, that's the challenge that Orwell presents us with.
Yeah.
He's not offering easy answers or simplistic solutions. Instead, he's forcing us to confront the uncomfortable realities of power control and the human capacity for both good and evil. 1984 is a warning, but it's also a call to action. It's a reminder that we can't take freedom for granted.
Right.
That we have to be vigilant in defending our right to think for ourselves, to question authority, and to resist any attempt to control our minds.
One of the things that struck me the most about the novel was the power of language. Newspeak is such a brilliant and terrifying concept. By shrinking the language, they're shrinking the very capacity for thought. It's like they're literally trying to reshape the human mind.
It's linguistic engineering at its most insidious. And what's scary is that, we see echoes of this in our own world. Think about the way certain groups try to control language.
Right.
To police what can be said, to limit the range of acceptable discourse. It's a way of controlling thought itself, shaping the way people perceive reality. Orwell understood that language is a powerful tool
Right.
and that it can be used for both liberation and oppression.
It's a reminder that we need to be mindful of the language we use, the words we choose, and the ways in which language can be used to manipulate and control. We need to be critical thinkers, to question the narratives that are presented to us, and to resist any attempt to limit our ability to express ourselves freely.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another key theme of the novel, the manipulation of history. Winston's job at the Ministry of Truth, the way they alter records and rewrite the past to fit the party's narrative. It's a chilling reminder that history is not objective.
Right.
It's a story.
Story, yeah.
And that story can be told in many different ways. Whoever controls the narrative controls the past.
Yeah.
And by controlling the past, they control the present and the future.
You know, it's funny. I remember thinking that part of the book was a bit far-fetched when I first read. I mean, rewriting history, come on, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But then you start to see how it happens in subtle ways, even in our own society. The way certain events are emphasized or downplayed, the way historical figures are portrayed, the way certain voices are silenced or marginalized.
Exactly.
It's all part of shaping the narrative.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be critical of the historical narratives that we're presented with.
Right.
To question the sources, to consider different perspectives, to be aware of the biases and agendas that might be shaping the way history is told.
It's like being a detective, you know, piecing together the clues, trying to figure out what really happened.
Right.
And sometimes the truth is more complicated and less clear-cut than we'd like it to be.
Precisely. History is not just about dates and facts. It's about interpretation, about meaning, about the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we come from.
And speaking of stories, one of the most effective ways the party controls the population in 1984 is by creating enemies. You know, by using fear and hatred to unify the people against a common threat. Goldstein, the Eurasian soldier on the posters, the constant threat of war. It's all designed to keep people in line and distracted from the real issues. It's classic scapegoating. Create an enemy, a threat, an other. And you can justify almost any action, any policy, any level of control. We see this tactic used throughout history, and it's still incredibly effective today.
Yeah. I'm embarrassed to admit it, but I fall for it all the time. You know, you see a news report about some terrible crime, some act of terrorism, and it's easy to get caught up in the fear and anger.
Right.
It's easy to forget that these are complex issues with no easy answers, and that there are often powerful forces manipulating those emotions for their own benefit.
Well, it's human nature to crave certainty, to seek simple solutions to complex problems, and that's what makes us so vulnerable to manipulation.
Yeah.
We want to believe that there's a clear enemy, a good versus evil narrative, a simple solution to the world's problems, but the reality is far more nuanced and ambiguous.
So what's the answer? How do we resist this kind of manipulation? How do we avoid falling into the traps that Orwell lays out for us in 1984? It's not easy, but it starts with awareness. We need to be aware of the ways in which power operates, the ways in which language and history can be manipulated, the ways in which fear and hatred can be used to control us. We need to be critical thinkers, to question authority, to challenge the narratives that are presented to us. We need to be willing to engage in difficult conversations, to consider different perspectives, to hold our own beliefs up to scrutiny.
It sounds exhausting, to be honest.
Yeah.
But I guess the alternative is far worse. If we're not willing to do the work, if we're not willing to be uncomfortable, then we risk sleepwalking into a world that looks a lot like Oceania.
That's the challenge Orwell leaves us with. 1984 is not just a warning about what might happen in the future. It's a reflection of the human condition, of our capacity for both good and evil, and of the constant struggle for freedom and autonomy. It's a reminder that the battle for our minds and hearts is ongoing, and that we all have a role to play in defending the values of truth, justice, and individual liberty.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into 1984, I'm left with a sense of unease, but also a renewed determination to be more aware, more critical, more engaged. It's a book that will stay with me, that will continue to challenge me, and that will hopefully inspire me to be a more thoughtful and responsible citizen. I hope it does the same for you.
And remember, the most important thing is to never stop questioning, never stop thinking for yourself, and never give up hope, even in the darkest of times.